All right, thank you very much. I'm going to talk about the methodology in the work process in VIA-Bundus, and in particular, our work with the database and mapping. And it's my aim to show what thoughts went into the database and the map, and especially where the limitations are. So let's start. So the underlying thought was that we see the map as a network, and a network consists of nodes and edges. And in our case, the nodes we defined as any place along a route where something happens, and edges are the roads and waterways. So as we already mentioned, the nodes we adopted from the work of Bruns and Wicziarka, which were around 9,000 nodes at the beginning. They mentioned waypoints, tolls, bridges, and Bruns and Wicziarka used a lot of primary literature and oriented themselves via historical maps. And then we also added some nodes that were necessary because we did some further research. So how did we place those nodes? As I said, we place nodes wherever something happens, waypoints like settlements, towns, harbors, but also where something happened along the way, like tolls, bridges, or staples. When we placed nodes for settlements or towns, they were usually placed in the center of this place, like a marketplace, the oldest church, or the village center. If it made sense, of course, for the road. In some cases, the node was slightly moved to fit the road and thus not cause unnecessary detours for the route planner. We tried, however, to place nodes as historically accurate as possible and feasible within the scope of the project. So if the location of a toll or harbor is known, the node was placed there. In such cases, we added those nodes as child nodes of other nodes, which share the main attributes and the data of the parent nodes, but also have the additional attribute like toll or harbor. We also added a GeoNames ID to places which can still be found today, which is obviously not always the case. The attributes we added are the following: settlements. Settlements can be any type of human habitation, like villages, monasteries, castles, or watchtowers. A special kind of settlement was a town, and we are very aware that the definition of a town is very fluid and depends on the region. For now, suffice to say that a larger settlement of a more central character is seen as a town within the project. We have fairs. This is a special attribute for reasons we'll go into later. And we added any annual fairs we could find within the region, the project. Then we have staples. Staple we understood as the forced unloading of wares for a certain amount of time, usually in trading centers. We have tolls, and tolls we see as any kind of payment along the road. We only included tolls, customs, and fees that related to traffic, such as fees of safe conduct. Market tolls and tolls on certain wares were therefore not specifically included. Then we have bridges. I guess those are pretty self-explanatory. Ferries were included mostly only if it connected long-distance roads. Long-distance ferries were generally not included, at least not in the German regions of the project. Other regions such as Denmark and to an extent the Netherlands depend heavily on ferries for their long-distance travel. So there, of course, it was included. And then we have harbors and locks, which are quite self-explanatory again. In the interest of time, I won't go into detail anymore about the attributes. For that, please have a look at the project documentation where there are a lot more thoughts on the attributes, and you can also ask afterwards. It should also be noted that it was not our main goal to create a complete data set on any of the attributes. Our main focus were, of course, the roads. On some key nodes, we did some more research, but mostly from secondary literature. In other cases, we just added data for whatever we could find in passing, which was also already considerable. The special attribute I mentioned earlier, the fair, we played around with a little bit, because due to the annual character of the fairs, they could be added to the database with specific dates. And with these dates, we could build a calendar that shows the dates and durations of fairs for a desired year. And on the map in the upper right, fairs in the surrounding area are displayed, and in the upper left, the radius can be adjusted to your own flavor. Again, as with the other attributes, the fair calendar was not the main goal of Via Bundus, and therefore the research on the fairs may not be complete, but we tried. Here's an overview of the sources we used for the nodes. Of course, Bruns and Ricerca, as already mentioned, we used a lot of data from them because they also derived many data from the primary sources, which we did not necessarily do. We also drew some basic data from lexical works, such as the Deutsches Städtebuch, the Deutsches Ortsnamenbuch, or the Handbuch der historischen Städten Deutschlands for the German part. Of course, a lot of secondary sources and to an extent primary sources. For a full list of sources, again, please have a look at the documentation. And also, since the sources differ greatly from region to region, also have a look at the documentation for the respective regions. Let's go on with the edges or the roads. So we have laid our focus on revising the routes described in Bruns and Ricerca and adding additional trade routes whenever we came across them in our research. This we did by defining first routes and roads. So it was quite important that we talk about routes and roads within the project. So routes we see as the theoretical connection between two places, and roads are the actual physical path between two nodes. And it became quite clear early that routes are more important to us than roads. So it was more important to show the connections between places than actually reconstruct the physical paths. Because if you want to reconstruct actual physical paths, or also if you are reconstructing routes, you are faced with some challenges such as incomplete information. Roads and routes are seldomly mentioned in sources, and if they are descriptions that where there was only described how to get from A to B, but not the exact path. Also, the description might vary from source to source. There were temporal dynamics, so roads are less static than one might think. They have changed in the course of history, or there were seasonal influences. Roads and land travel are dependent on the weather. So in some seasons, you could just not pass somewhere, which we can not necessarily see nowadays. We can get an idea, but I'll go into that later. And then, of course, there is the challenge of state of research. Some roads have drawn more attention than others, if at all. So our work was therefore largely dependent on what others have already researched. Again, we start with Bruns and Ricerca. So the sources, of course, are those cited in Bruns and Ricerca, primary and secondary sources. We also added, of course, secondary sources. We also used historical maps, mostly from the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. And we also tried to reconstruct roads based on topographical circumstances. And by knowing a little bit about the way medieval roads were formed and where they usually ran. And digital terrain models based on LiDAR data helped us give an idea in that respect. It has to be kept in mind, of course, that the sources used in our research always vary greatly within the regions, given the different prerequisites. Again, for more details on the sources, please have a look at the documentations. The edges have parameters. We gave them parameters to face the challenges I mentioned earlier. So we gave them a certainty. It ranges from 1 to 3, where 3 is the most insecure rating. This road or such roads are displayed as dashed lines on the map and really just say that we know that there must have been a road in that area, but we have no good idea of where it actually ran. We have from and to dates, since in some cases we can tell that roads appeared or disappeared in the course of history. They were given a time period which can be displayed on the map. We also have a zoom. So in order to keep the map nice and neat, we had to reduce the amount of roads you can actually see the further you zoom out. So sometimes you may have to zoom further in order to see all the roads that we actually drew and in order to see variations and detours for one course. And we have comments. Those are pretty self-explanatory. Whenever we wanted to say something or comment on a certain route, there will be a comment, and Bart will show you later how to see those comments. There are 2 more things I want to draw your attention to. The edges that are waterways, they were basically drawn in the same way as roads. They have the same parameters as the roads. We started only wanting to map waterways that were important for the understanding of the land travel system. But since both areas are very closely intertwined, we ended up mapping a lot more waterways than anticipated. And of course, there are regions in which waterways are much more important than in others. So the detail on the waterways will differ depending on what region you are looking at. A short word on the data structure for those who are interested. So the data on nodes and edges was entered into an SQL database, and Leaflet was used to visualize the edges we had drawn in QGIS. And one more thing you will encounter when playing with the map are town outlines. We added some town outlines in order to give a better impression on how towns and roads related to each other in the landscape. And the outlines we added are the known extent of the towns in the 16th century. And for that, we refer to secondary literature, historical maps, and hints given by modern town topography. Again, since this was something we came up with along the way and mostly added in the passing, the town outlines are by no means complete or precise. All right, so this should be not enough theory for now, and I will leave you with Bart to play around with the map.